The morning air carried a quiet chill, the kind that clung stubbornly to the skin despite the weak promises of sunlight. The city was already awake, its rhythm steady and unhurried. People moved with the practiced efficiency of routine businessmen in tailored coats. Mothers with children in tow, and students with backpacks slung over their shoulders. The street hummed with life. But as usual, she was invisible. The woman sat on the edge of the sidewalk, her thin frame wrapped in layers of mismatched clothing. Her scarf, frayed at the edges, bore the muted hues of long-forgotten vibrancy. Beside her lay a small, carefully folded blanket and a tin cup with a single quarter rattling at the bottom. She had been there for hours, greeting each passerby with a soft, "Good morning," but few met her gaze. And fewer still offered even a nod in return. She was used to it. To her left stood a bakery, its window fogged from the warmth within. The smell of freshly baked bread seeped into the street, mingling with the metallic tang of exhaust and the faint scent of rain. It was a small shop, the kind where the owner worked the register and knew the names of regular customers. She had passed by it many times, always tempted by the comforting aroma but too wary of the sharp looks from the man behind the counter. Today, hunger gnawed at her with unusual persistence. She hesitated, her hand tightening around the straps of her bag, a small, battered thing that contained all she owned. The thought of asking was humiliating, but hunger had a way of stripping pride down to its rawest edges. With a deep breath, she pushed herself to her feet. Leaning on the cane that had seen better days, she shuffled toward the bakery, her heart heavy with the weight of anticipation. The door jingled as she entered, the sound too cheerful for what awaited her inside. The warmth hit her first, followed by the curious glances of a few customers. The shopkeeper, a stout man with thinning hair, looked up from the counter. His eyes narrowed slightly, his lips pressing into a line. She didn't miss the way he adjusted his posture, as if bracing himself for trouble. "Excuse me," she began, her voice soft, almost apologetic. What do you want?" His tone was sharp, cutting through her words before they had a chance to settle. The room seemed to pause, the quiet murmurs of other customers fading into the background. She swallowed hard, glancing at the loaves displayed behind him. They were golden and perfect, their crusts glinting under the warm light. "Just a small loaf," she said finally, her voice trembling. I can't pay, but The shopkeeper's sigh was loud, deliberate. "This isn't a charity," he said, his voice rising just enough to carry across the room. A few heads turned, but no one spoke. "If you want bread, you pay like everyone else." Her cheeks flushed, though her expression remained calm. Years of enduring moments like these had taught her to keep her dignity intact, even as it was trampled underfoot. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words refused to come. Instead, she nodded faintly and turned to leave, the jingling bell marking her exit. Outside, the world continued as it always did. Cars rolled past, their drivers oblivious to the small woman standing on the curb, her cane steadying her against the weight of disappointment. She glanced back at the bakery window, watching as the shopkeeper returned to his work, his face already relaxed into indifference. It was just another day, another reminder that kindness, like bread, often came with a price. But as she stood there, lost in thought, she didn't notice the man watching her from inside the bakery. His gaze lingered on her face, recognition dawning slowly, like the first light of morning breaking through a heavy fog. The air inside the bakery was warm, carrying the heady scent of cinnamon rolls and crusty baguettes. The shopkeeper moved briskly behind the counter, ringing up orders with the efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. His small, curt nods to familiar faces and absent smiles painted him as someone who took pride in his work but saw little need for pleasantries beyond the transaction. When she entered, it was as though an unwelcome breeze had slipped through the door. The conversation among the customers slowed, their voices lowering as they glanced toward her, curious but unwilling to engage. The shopkeeper froze mid-motion, his hand hovering over the cash register. His eyes swept over her with the practiced quickness of someone who had learned to measure others in an instant. The message was clear: she didn't belong. She stood just inside the doorway, gripping her cane tightly, her clothes, worn and mismatched, hung loosely on her small frame, and the weariness etched into her face seemed out of place in the cheery glow of the bakery. For a moment, the hum of the shop fell silent. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I was wondering if you might spare." The shopkeeper cut her off, his voice firm and rehearsed. "We don't give handouts here." The statement landed heavily, not because it was unexpected, but because of how quickly it came, as if it had been waiting on the tip of his tongue. The woman paused, her lips parting slightly as if to protest. But she didn't. Instead, she nodded faintly, the movement so small it was almost imperceptible. "I understand," she said, her words careful, deliberate. "But I thought." "You thought wrong," he snapped, his voice louder now, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. "I've got a business to run. If you're not buying, you're wasting my time." The room seemed to hold its breath. A mother shifted uncomfortably near the counter, her young daughter clutching her hand and staring wide-eyed at the exchange. A man in a suit glanced toward the door, as if calculating the quickest way to leave without becoming involved. The few remaining customers busied themselves with their phones or the pastries in their hands, their silence a tacit agreement to let the moment pass without intervention. The woman stood her ground, her expression calm but resolute. She didn't plead or argue. Instead, she simply turned toward the loaves of bread displayed neatly on the shelves, her eyes lingering on a small, round one near the bottom. Its golden crust seemed impossibly far from her reach. "I've worked before, you know," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I've earned my keep." The shopkeeper frowned, his impatience bubbling just beneath the surface. "Lady, I don't have time for a history lesson. Either you buy something, or you leave." Her gaze returned to him, steady and unwavering, and for a moment, the weight of her dignity pressed against the casual cruelty in his words. But the moment passed quickly. She nodded once more, her silence carrying a grace that his harshness could not touch. She turned toward the door, her steps slow but deliberate. Behind her, the shopkeeper shook his head, muttering something under his breath that was lost to the sound of the bell jingling as she stepped outside. Inside, the bakery returned to its rhythm. The shopkeeper resumed his work, the tension dissipating as quickly as it had arrived. The customers exchanged quiet glances, their discomfort quickly replaced by the comfort of routine. It was easier, after all, to let the world's injustices remain someone else's problem. But near the back of the room, a man remained still. He was younger than most of the others, his neatly pressed shirt and polished shoes hinting at a life of order and success. His brow furrowed as he watched her retreating figure through the glass. Something about her was familiar, a flicker of memory tugging at the edges of his mind. He stayed where he was, unmoving, as the pieces began to fall into place. The shopkeeper called for the next customer, the register ringing cheerfully, but the man didn't hear it. His focus was elsewhere, locked on a truth he couldn't yet name but knew was important. Outside, the woman paused near the curb, her hand resting on her cane as she adjusted the weight of her small bag. She didn't look back at the bakery, didn't acknowledge the man watching her from within. The moment was fleeting, unnoticed by most, but for him, it carried the unmistakable weight of recognition. The city moved on, its indifference unbroken, but the man remained still, his gaze fixed on the woman who had just left, and on the question she had unknowingly placed in his heart. The man sat at his small table near the back of the bakery, his coffee growing cold in the cup. He hadn't intended to linger, but something about the woman's presence had stopped him. Her voice, soft but unwavering, had echoed faintly in his mind, tugging at memories he couldn't yet place. From his vantage point, he had watched the entire exchange, the shopkeeper's irritation, the sidelong glances from other customers, the way the woman held herself as if carrying the weight of the world on her back. It all felt uncomfortably familiar, though he couldn't immediately say why. He had seen moments like this before. Different faces, different places, but the same unspoken calculus. A person like her wasn't worth the trouble. The looks seemed to say. Easier to dismiss her, to turn away and return to the comforting normalcy of one's own life. It wasn't outright hatred, it rarely was, but a kind of casual cruelty born from indifference. The kind that settled into the fabric of daily life so seamlessly it often went unnoticed. He sipped his coffee, now lukewarm, and stared out the window. She was still there, standing on the curb, her cane planted firmly by her side. She wasn't begging, wasn't causing a scene, she was just standing, as though gathering herself for whatever came next. The recognition hit him like a jolt of electricity, sudden and sharp. He leaned back in his chair, his hand tightening around the cup as the memory took shape. It had been years ago, in a part of the city he rarely visited now. He had been a teenager then, reckless and angry, lost in the haze of addiction. His days had blurred into a chaotic mix of desperation and denial. And he had believed, with the certainty of youth, that he was beyond saving. She had been there, not on the street, but in a small community center tucked between a liquor store and a laundromat. She had been a volunteer, her presence quiet but steady, her words measured and kind. He couldn't even remember what she had said to him back then. Only the way she had looked at him as if he was worth something. Even when he couldn't see it himself. It had been a turning point, though he hadn't realized it at the time. Her words, her unwavering belief in his ability to change, had planted a seed that eventually grew into the life he had now, a life free from the chaos that had once defined him. And now, here she was, reduced to standing outside a bakery, humiliated for the crime of asking for bread. The thought sat heavy in his chest, an uncomfortable knot of guilt and gratitude. He glanced around the bakery. The shopkeeper was busy with another customer, his irritation from earlier already forgotten. The other patrons had moved on, their attention back on their pastries and coffee. No one seemed to notice the woman outside. Or if they did, they chose not to care. He set down his cup and stood, smoothing the front of his shirt as he moved toward the door. The bell jingled as he stepped outside, the brisk air striking him after the warmth of the bakery. She turned slightly at the sound, her expression cautious but curious. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quiet, unsure. "Excuse me." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, he faltered. She was older than he remembered, her face lined with years of hardship. But the steadiness in her gaze was the same. It was her. He was certain of it. "Do you remember me?" he asked, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. She tilted her head, studying him with a mix of curiosity and weariness. "Should I?" He smiled faintly, though there was a tremor in it. "Maybe not. It's been a long time. But I remember you. You helped me once. When I didn't think anyone could." Her brow furrowed slightly, the lines deepening. She didn't respond immediately, and he wondered if he had made a mistake. Perhaps she didn't remember him at all. But then her expression softened, a flicker of recognition sparking in her eyes. "You were one of the boys," she said slowly, "at the center." He nodded, his throat tightening. "Yes. And because of you, He stopped, swallowing hard. "You saved my life." She didn't reply, but the look in her eyes shifted, the weariness giving way to something else, something quieter, deeper. For a moment, the noise of the city seemed to fade, leaving just the two of them standing on the sidewalk, bound by a shared history neither had expected to revisit. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. "Please, let me get you something," he said. "A loaf of bread, or whatever you need." Her lips pressed together, and she shook her head. "I didn't help you back then to be repaid now." "I know," he said quickly, "but I want to. Please." She hesitated, her grip tightening on her cane. Then, finally, she nodded. The faintest trace of a smile crossed her face, and he felt the knot in his chest loosen slightly. It wasn't much, he knew, but it was something. A chance to offer a kindness she had once so freely given him. The man re-entered the bakery, the jingling bell marking his return. Inside, the air was warm, rich with the scent of fresh pastries. But the atmosphere felt heavier now. He moved purposefully to the counter, his presence drawing the curious glances of the other customers. The shopkeeper glanced up, his expression neutral at first but hardening slightly when he saw the man approach. "Back for something else?" he asked. His voice clipped, wary. The man nodded. "Yes. A loaf of bread, please." His tone was calm, polite, But there was a subtle edge to it, a quiet defiance that seemed to catch the shopkeeper off guard. "Which one?" the shopkeeper asked, motioning toward the neatly arranged loaves on the shelves behind him. "The small one on the bottom," the man replied without hesitation, his voice steady. "The one she was looking at." For a moment, the shopkeeper hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the window where the woman still stood, her silhouette visible against the bright morning light. He frowned, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You know, she's not." "I didn't ask for your opinion," the man interrupted, his tone firm but measured. "Just the bread." The shopkeeper's frown deepened, but he turned to retrieve the loaf. The transaction was quick, businesslike. The man handed over a few bills and waited as the bread was placed in a brown paper bag. When it was done, he nodded his thanks, then turned and walked back toward the door. As he stepped outside, the cold air hit him once again, sharp and bracing. The woman was still standing by the curb, her gaze distant, her hand resting lightly on the top of her cane. She didn't notice him at first, lost in thought, but when he approached, she turned toward him, her expression cautious. "I got it for you," he said, holding out the bag. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand his intentions. Slowly, she reached out and took the bag, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the paper. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "It's the least I can do," he replied, "for everything you did for me." Her gaze dropped to the bag in her hands, and for a moment, she seemed to retreat inward, lost in her own thoughts. Then she looked back at him, her expression quiet but resolute. "I remember you now," she said. "You were the one who always sat in the back. Never said much." He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "That was me. You've done well for yourself," she said, her tone neither approving nor critical, simply observant. "I'm glad. I owe it to you," he said. "You believed in me when no one else did." She shook her head slightly, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "You did the hard work. I just reminded you that you could." They stood there in silence for a moment, the city bustling around them, the noise and movement creating a strange kind of stillness between them. It was a quiet moment, heavy with unspoken words and shared understanding. "You don't have to be out here. You know," he said finally, his voice tentative. "There are places that can help." Her smile faded slightly, replaced by a weariness that went deeper than fatigue. "I've been to those places," she said. "They're not always what they seem. Sometimes it's easier out here, even if it doesn't look like it." He nodded, though he wasn't sure he understood. There were parts of her life, her experiences, that he couldn't fully grasp. But he didn't need to. What mattered was that she stood before him, whole and dignified, despite everything. "If you ever need anything," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small card. "This is my number. Call me anytime." She took the card, her fingers brushing against the edges as she studied it. "Thank you," she said again, her voice steady now. "For the bread, and for remembering." He nodded, unsure of what else to say. The bell above the bakery door jingled behind him as another customer entered, the sound breaking the moment like the distant toll of a clock. He glanced back at the bakery, at the shopkeeper watching them through the glass, his expression unreadable. The man turned back to the woman. "Take care of yourself," he said softly. She nodded, her grip on the bag tightening slightly. "You too." As he walked away, she stood there for a long time, the paper bag clutched to her chest, her gaze following him until he disappeared into the crowd. Then, with a quiet sigh, she turned and began to walk, her cane tapping softly against the pavement. The bread was warm against her hands. A small, simple kindness in a world that so often refused her even that. And though the day was still cold, she felt a faint warmth growing inside her, steady and quiet, like the first rays of sunlight breaking through a heavy morning fog. The woman walked slowly down the street, the loaf of bread cradled in her hands. The bustling city seemed to move around her without notice, as though her presence were just another detail in a busy, indifferent canvas. Her cane tapped rhythmically against the pavement, a steady counterpoint to the shuffle of her worn shoes. The paper bag was warm, and the weight of it was strangely comforting. She hadn't held something so simple, so ordinary, in what felt like a long time. For her, this loaf of bread was more than nourishment, it was a small reminder that kindness still existed in a world that often seemed to have forgotten her. As she walked, she thought about the man. His face was familiar now, though she hadn't recognized him at first. So many years had passed, and time had worn its marks on both of them. Yet, beneath the polish of his appearance and the confidence in his voice, she could still see the boy he had been, a boy lost in a storm of his own making. Searching for a lifeline, she had offered him that lifeline, though it hadn't seemed like much at the time. A conversation, a few words of encouragement, a reminder that he was more than his worst days. She hadn't expected to see him again, let alone find herself on the receiving end of his gratitude. The thought unsettled her, though she couldn't say why. At the corner of the street, she paused, leaning heavily on her cane. The city hummed around her, cars honking, footsteps hurrying by, snippets of conversation carried on the wind. No one stopped, no one noticed. It was a familiar feeling, one she had long since grown accustomed to. But today, it felt different, less like isolation and more like space. As if the world had given her a moment to breathe. She glanced down at the loaf of bread, her reflection faintly visible in the crinkled paper. The man's words echoed in her mind, "You saved my life." She hadn't thought of it that way, hadn't seen her actions as anything extraordinary. She had simply done what she could, what she believed was right. Yet, to him, it had been everything. The thought brought a faint smile to her lips, though it was tinged with sadness. How many others had she tried to help? How many had she failed? The boy she remembered had found his way, but there were others whose faces still haunted her, young men and women she had tried to reach, only to watch them slip through her fingers like sand. She had carried those memories with her, the weight of them growing heavier over the years. The sound of footsteps drew her attention, and she looked up to see a woman approaching, her face marked with the lines of age and worry. She was carrying a heavy bag of groceries, her pace slow, her shoulders stooped under the weight. As she passed, their eyes met briefly, a flicker of recognition passing between them. The woman hesitated, as if considering whether to say something, but then continued on, her steps quickening. The homeless woman watched her go, her expression unreadable. There had been a time when she might have offered to help, but now she wasn't sure if the gesture would be welcomed or ignored. The world had changed in ways she didn't always understand, and her place in it felt more uncertain with each passing day. Still, she turned and continued walking, the loaf of bread held carefully in her hands. She had no destination in mind, no place to go, but the simple act of moving forward felt like its own small victory. The bread was a gift, a reminder that her past hadn't been forgotten, that her efforts had mattered to someone. And for now, that was enough. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. The day was ending, and with it came the quiet promise of another chance, another moment to be seen, to be remembered, to matter. She clung to that promise as she walked, her steps slow but steady, her grip firm on the simple, extraordinary gift she had been given. The streets were quieter now, the rhythm of the day giving way to the slower pace of evening. The golden light of the setting sun cast long shadows across the pavement, painting the city in shades of amber and gray. The woman had found a small bench at the edge of a park, its paint chipped and faded. It wasn't much, but it was a place to sit, a moment of respite. She set the loaf of bread beside her, resting her hands on her cane as she watched the world move around her. Children ran across the grass, their laughter ringing out in sharp contrast to the quiet murmurs of the adults nearby. A couple walked by, their hands intertwined, their conversation too soft to catch. Life continued, as it always did, with its steady ebb and flow. Her thoughts drifted back to the bakery, to the man who had recognized her, who had thanked her. She hadn't expected gratitude, not then, not now. She had done what she could in her life, offered what little she had to those who needed it, but she had never thought of it as extraordinary. It was simply what one did, or what one should do. And yet, his words lingered. "You saved my life." She turned the phrase over in her mind, examining it from every angle. trying to reconcile it with the reality of her own circumstances. How strange it was, she thought, to be seen as a savior by someone who now seemed so far removed from the struggles she still faced. A shadow passed over her, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked up to see a young woman standing nearby, her arms full of books and a hesitant smile on her face. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice tentative. "Do you mind if I sit here?" The older woman gestured to the empty space beside her. "Go ahead." The young woman sat, her books balanced precariously on her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them filled with the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. "I saw you earlier," the young woman said finally. "At the bakery." The older woman glanced at her, surprised. "You were there?" The young woman nodded. "I was in the corner, trying to stay out of the way. I saw what happened." There was no judgment in her tone, only quiet observation. The older woman waited, unsure of what to say. "It wasn't right," the young woman continued, her gaze fixed on the books in her lap. "The way he treated you." The older woman gave a faint smile, though there was little humor in it. "It's not the first time. Won't be the last. But it shouldn't happen," the young woman said, her voice firm now, tinged with a quiet anger. "It's not fair." The older woman studied her for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Fairness is a luxury," she said finally. "Not everyone gets to afford it." The young woman looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time. There was a sadness in her eyes, a recognition that went beyond words. For a moment, the generational divide between them seemed to collapse, leaving only two people bound by a shared understanding of the world's quiet injustices. "Thank you," the younger woman said suddenly, her voice soft, "for standing your ground, for being you." The older woman raised an eyebrow. "I didn't do much of anything." "You did more than you think," the young woman replied. "Just being there, refusing to disappear, that means something." The older woman turned away, her gaze drifting back to the park. The children were still running, their laughter ringing out like a melody against the backdrop of the city. She thought of the man at the bakery, of the young woman beside her, of all the faces that had passed her by over the years. Maybe they were right. Maybe simply being seen, being remembered, was its own quiet act of defiance. The sun dipped lower, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. The young woman stood, gathering her books. "Take care," she said, her smile warm but fleeting. "You too," the older woman replied, watching as she walked away. She sat there for a long time after, the loaf of bread beside her, the fading light casting long shadows across the park. The world was still moving, still turning, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a small, steady flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. By the next morning, the city had returned to its usual rhythm. Streets were bustling with early commuters, their faces drawn with the focus of routine. Cafes filled with the hum of conversation, the clink of cups, and the faint hiss of steaming milk. It was a world that seemed to move in unison, each part blending seamlessly into the other, leaving little room for anything or anyone that disrupted its flow. The shopkeeper at the bakery wiped the counter absently, his mind elsewhere. The exchange from the previous day lingered at the edges of his thoughts. Unbidden and unwelcome, he had brushed it off at first. Just another fleeting moment in a long string of similar encounters. But something about the man's words, about the quiet confrontation, gnawed at him in a way he couldn't shake. "You didn't have to speak to her like that," the man had said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement, calm and pointed, and yet, it had landed with more weight than the shopkeeper cared to admit. The bell above the door jingled, pulling him back to the present. A customer entered, a middle-aged woman with a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. She ordered a coffee and a croissant, her voice cheerful as she made small talk. He smiled, nodded, played his part, but as he handed her the coffee, her expression changed. "I heard something about yesterday," she said, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "The woman who came in, the man who helped her. I wasn't here, but," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "it's been the talk of the neighborhood." The shopkeeper stiffened slightly, his hands pausing over the counter. "People talk too much," he muttered, brushing her comment aside. Maybe, she replied, taking her coffee, but sometimes, people need to talk. She left without another word, the door closing softly behind her. The shopkeeper stood there for a moment, the hum of the bakery continuing around him. He shook his head and returned to his work. But the knot in his chest tightened. Blank. Underscore. Blank. On the other side of the city, the man who had bought the loaf of bread was walking through the park. He didn't come here often, but today he felt compelled, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. In his hand, he carried a cup of coffee, the warmth of it seeping through his fingers and grounding him in the crisp morning air. He had spent much of the night thinking about the woman, her quiet dignity, her resilience in the face of what should have broken her. He thought about her impact on his life, about the ways her kindness had rippled outward, shaping him, shaping the man he had become. And he wondered, how many others had she touched? How many lives had she changed? Unknowingly, with the simple force of her presence? As he walked, he noticed a small group of people gathered by a bench near the edge of the park. At the center of the group was the woman, her cane resting against her knee, the loaf of bread balanced carefully in her lap. She was speaking, her voice low but steady, her words carrying just enough to reach those around her. He moved closer, keeping a respectful distance. The group consisted of a mix of faces young and old, strangers who had stopped to listen. She wasn't telling a dramatic story or making a plea for help. Instead, she was sharing fragments of her life, reflections on the world as she had seen it, as she continued to see it. Her words weren't extraordinary, but they were honest, unvarnished. She spoke of small kindnesses, of the moments that mattered more than anyone realized. She spoke of the young man she had once helped, her tone light but thoughtful, as though she were recounting a favorite memory. The man felt a lump rise in his throat. She hadn't mentioned his name, hadn't made it about him. But he knew. One by one, the group began to disperse, offering quiet nods of thanks as they left. Some left coins in her lap. Others simply smiled. But all of them carried something intangible, a piece of her story, a thread of her resilience. When the last of them had gone, the man approached. She looked up as he neared, her eyes narrowing slightly in recognition. "You came back," she said simply. He nodded, unable to find the right words. He held out the coffee, and she accepted it with a faint smile. "Why do you share so much?" he asked after a moment, his voice hesitant. "Even when people don't always listen." She took a sip of the coffee, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. "Because it's the only way things change," she said, "one person at a time." Her words were quiet, unassuming, but they stayed with him as they sat together in the soft light of the morning. The park moved on around them, a steady hum of life. But for a moment, the world felt still, and in that stillness, he understood what she meant. It wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping transformations. It was about the ripples, the small acts of kindness that spread outward, touching lives in ways that couldn't always be seen. It was about being seen, being remembered, being heard, and in her quiet, persistent way, she had managed to do all three. The days that followed were much like any other. The rhythms of the city continuing unabated. The woman remained on her usual corner, her cane propped against the bench where she sat most mornings. People passed her by, some offering spare change or polite nods, others averting their eyes as though her presence was too much to acknowledge. It was a life she had come to accept, though not without its quiet, unspoken weight. But something had shifted. The loaf of bread she carried that day felt like more than nourishment. It was a symbol, a small reminder that the world still held room for kindness, even when it seemed in short supply. And though she didn't speak of it to anyone, the encounter at the bakery remained with her, a thread of memory she held close. One morning, as the sun broke through the gray haze of the city, she was approached by a man in a tailored coat. He was older, with silver hair and a briefcase in hand, the kind of person she had grown used to seeing hurry past her without a second glance. But this man stopped, standing a few feet away, his expression hesitant. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cautious. "You don't know me, but I've heard about you." She looked up, her brow furrowing slightly. "Heard about me?" He nodded, adjusting the strap of his briefcase. From the young man at the bakery. He mentioned you, said you helped him once. And then, well, others started talking about what happened that day. The woman tilted her head. Studying him, she could see the discomfort in his posture. The way his words seemed to stumble over themselves. But there was something else too, something softer. More genuine. I wanted to say thank you. He continued, his voice growing steadier. Not just for what you did for him, but for being here. For reminding people like me that we need to do better. The words hung in the air. Simple but profound. The woman nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. I didn't do much, she said finally. Just what I could. And sometimes that's enough, he replied. He placed an envelope on the bench beside her. Then stepped back. I hope it helps. Even a little. She glanced at the envelope but didn't reach for it right away. Instead, she looked back at him. Her gaze calm but piercing. Why now? She asked. Her tone neither accusing nor unkind. Why not yesterday? Or the day before that? The man hesitated, his hand tightening on the strap of his briefcase. Because sometimes it takes seeing someone else's courage to find your own. He said quietly. The woman studied him for a moment longer. Then nodded. Thank you, she said simply. He smiled faintly, a gesture that seemed to carry equal parts gratitude and apology. Before turning and walking away, she watched him go, the envelope resting untouched on the bench beside her. Later that day, she opened it. Inside was a small stack of bills and a note written in careful, precise handwriting. You matter. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. She read the words twice. Then folded the note and placed it carefully in her bag. The money was practical, it would help her in ways she couldn't yet name, but the note was something else. It was a reminder, a validation of her existence in a world that so often tried to erase her. That evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, she sat on her bench and watched the city settle into dusk. The air was cool, the streets quieter now, but the faint hum of life remained. She thought of the man from the bakery, of the young woman in the park, of the stranger with the envelope. They were small moments, fragments of a larger story she couldn't quite piece together. But they carried with them a kind of hope. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel it. The city moved on, as it always did. But for her, something had changed. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, it was a quiet shift. A subtle reminder that even in a world weighed down by prejudice and indifference, there was room for connection, for understanding, for kindness, and that, she realized, was enough to keep moving forward. With the loaf of bread long gone and the day drawing to a close, she leaned on her cane and stood, her steps slow but steady as she made her way down the street. The weight she carried of her past, of the world's indifference, felt just a little lighter now. Buoyed by the knowledge that she had been seen, remembered, and valued. And in the fading light of the day, she walked on, her silhouette merging with the quiet hum of the city, her presence small but undeniable.